just need to work out which button I'm pressing. We Are Survivors' vision is about ensuring no male survivors left behind. So as an organisation, we work with boys and men affected by sexual abuse, rape and sexual exploitation. But I would argue that our vision is about no survivor left behind. So we stand really strongly and in support of tackling violence against women and girls, and I'm very proud of my record, my personal record, but also my organisation's record on that. And we will continue to stand tall and stand with women's organisations. I get a little bit tired. I've been around a bit too long now. This is my 18th year in this sector, 16 years nearly with the organisation, and I get a little bit tired of hearing the same old divisive bullshit. The stuff that tends to pit us against each other rather than sharing spaces together. Just because I'm standing here talking about men and boys doesn't mean I'm ignoring women and girls. And equally, if any women are going to be standing up here talking about women and girls, I'm quite happy to not hear anybody say, yeah, but what about men? It's tired, it's boring, and please could we stop it? And I know it's not, I hope it's not any of you in the room. I'm sure it's not. But I think we have to stand up and we have to start being really clear about what we're talking about. I'm talking about 1 in 6 men. So when we look from academia in what we used to call Western countries, that's not okay. We talk about high income countries now. In high income countries, we look at 1 in 6 males will experience some form of, in the broadest sense of the term, unwanted sexual experiences in their lifetime. I'm interested in that 1 in 6. I'm also interested in the 1 in 4 females with using the same informatics. I'm interested in making sure that we are looking at all of those people. But for that 1 in 6, when you start leaning into the prison population, suddenly it begins to shrink. And actually what we find is disproportionately there's more people in prison. We heard in one of the workshops earlier around trauma and ACEs. And so I want to kind of just prod that a little bit and tell you a little bit about our journey. We started working in prisons, you'll see, just before Operation U-Tree. So Operation U-Tree was really the big catalyst for us. And what we found, and despite the fact I sound proper posh, I'm from Manchester, what we found in Manchester, round about the start of the Savile, not even the Savile Inquiry, but when the documentary came out, what we found, and people forget about this, is that there was quite a lot of adult male survivors of sexual abuse from Savile, from that whole cohort, who interestingly were like located in Manchester. And I always was a bit scratching my head like, well, what's that about? And there was a theory that that's to do with because A Top of the Pops was filmed in Manchester in its very, very early days. And there was a whole question of like, what's kind of going on there? And some of these men were, as now adults, were beginning to talk about, oh, have you seen that thing on telly? And they were talking about it on the wings of prisons with very little support. So we started getting phone calls and having conversations with mental health trusts, with prison governors, with prison staff, probation, who was saying, is there any chance you could go and just have a conversation? So we started having those conversations. And I remember having a chat with a particular commissioner who's still around, so I'm not naming names. And they said to me, you know that men won't come and talk to you in prison about being a survivor? And I was like, yeah, they will. No, they won't. You see, what survivors want, and I just said, hold on a second. First of all, you're talking to one. Secondly, we're not this homogenous group of people. We have many different faces and many different needs. So please don't tell me what survivors want. This individual, this commissioner, was not a survivor theirself as well. I'm being very careful not even to gender that commissioner, so you have no idea who I'm talking about. I had a theory though, the Field of Dreams theory, build it and they will come. I know that our sector is built on that theory. The majority of organisations that set up to deal with survivors were built by women who had nowhere else to go. Survivors built this sector, survivors will continue to build this sector. And it's really important that we never forget that. So when commissioners and politicians and people are telling you, oh no, survivors won't like that, because what we know from research, there's a word that begins with P and ends with "is off." I would recommend you using it a little bit more than you do, because this sector knows what survivors want, because we listen to survivors. So I started listening to survivors, the survivors that were not being listened to. And what that meant was, as a survivor going into a prison and talking to prisoners and talking to other men, it meant that, which will be no surprise to you, people started joining together. People started going, oh, me too, before me too. And so what that meant was people began to start thinking more compassionately about themselves and about each other. And unsurprisingly, what that meant is people's behaviour got a bit more pro-social and a little bit less antisocial. And then governors and prison officers began to notice this, and probation officers began to notice this, and would say things like, you know, when you go in that room with those prisoners and like, what the fuck do you do? Because they come out and they're just like really well behaved. And I just said, I just listen to him and just have a conversation. For any of us survivors in the room that's ever sat with other survivors and just chatted and then gone, oh God, yeah, right, see you next week or whatever, and just feel much better. That's it. There's no great surprise here. It's not some massive big magic potion. It was just listening to people who we know when we think about adverse childhood experiences. The prison population has more people in it with adverse childhood experiences than any other population. So work continues and more people began to ask us, like, can we do this and can we do that? And I just kept saying, yeah. My board kept saying, will you stop saying yeah? And I kept going, no. Did you get, like, they told me not to say yes, so I said no. And then just about the first few months of the global pandemic, one of our commissioners, Tracy at NHS England, said, I know we've asked you to do those 2 prisons because you've been doing that one so good. I don't suppose you could do all 15 prisons in the Northwest, could you? And I said, Ali, so my Criminal Justice Services Director, Alison, can we just sort out 15 prisons across the Northwest in a global pandemic, please, when we're all in PPE and no one's allowed to be unlocked? And she went, yeah, and then moaned for the rest of her life that I made her do it. I'll get absolutely smashed for that later. When no one's looking, she'll give me a dig. But that's what we did. We joined together. We took some bits of our work previously. So back in 2013, we'd done a piece of work on the Belief in Change programme. Belief in Change programme was at HMP Risley. It was an interesting programme because it was faith-based. It was led by chaplaincy. And what they decided to do was to look at how do you bring people together to begin to teach compassion, to teach life skills. And in one of the life skills groups, which was peer-led, I'd been doing a BBC breakfast or something like that. So I'd been on telly talking about, I think, a new report that had come out. And two of the lads had seen me on telly, went back into their peer support group and said, and there's about 15 lads in that group, and said, oh my God, just saw this guy on telly from Manchester just talking about like what happened to him, and like, I think it happened to me as well. And 14 people said me too. And the prison officer who was in the room said it was like watching dominoes just go down, everybody fell. And so they contacted us and said, can you do something? And I was like, yeah. We went in, set up a peer support group, which we've been doing outside for ages, and tried to sort of measure. You know how commissioners like numbers, and so we decided to do something. And so one of the things that we've always stuck with is try to measure in a numerical way trauma. And I know people get really upset about this and, you know, well, you can't just measure it in numbers. Of course you can't. I'm not saying it's the only way, but I needed something. So we used the IESR, the Impact of Event Scale. It was one that I'd been using as I was at EMDR. I'm a qualified psychotherapist, and I was using it in EMDR because that's what most people use. And I just thought it was really interesting. Self-reported questionnaire that in some way gave somebody the ability to answer a whole load of questions and go, what would my trauma score be? What does that mean in a medical sense? And people began to get excited because what we were showing was the disproportionate amount of men in prison in HMP Risley who were reporting really high levels of trauma before we were talking about ACEs in this country, by the way. I know ACEs have been talked about in the States for donkey's years, but before we started talking about ACEs, and so we started seeing this really interesting trend. That carried on, and we started asking people, okay, so I've got all these scores and these numbers, but what do you think? What has been the impact of you being here, being in this group? And we started hearing people's words. And I will never defend the actions of any of my clients in prison. Never. I've worked with people who have done and committed some of the most heinous crimes known to us. But I will listen, and I will start trying to make sense of the world, exactly like I did as a survivor. We will never excuse what our clients have done, but it begins to help us understand why, the reason, not the excuse, the reason for somebody's behaviour, etc., etc. And one of the things that I heard one of my clients say, which has always stuck with me, and I use it so often. I was working with an individual who the crime that he committed had resulted in a number of people losing their life. A terrible, terrible crime, and I would argue, been failed by the system. The system had failed him repeatedly from childhood right through to adulthood, and it felt like he was stuck in something. Everything felt quite cyclical. That recidivism was really high of whenever he got the opportunity, even just to go to a lower category prison, something happened and he ended up being returned. We were chatting once and he said, do you know what I love about talking to you? And I said, what? And he went, it's like talking to a bird, but you're a bloke. I did challenge him on the use of the word bird, by the way. But what is that saying? What does that say? I think what he's saying is, my understanding of masculinity and maleness is that we don't show vulnerability and we don't show compassion and we don't show kindness, and you've shown all these things to me, and so my mind's not computing. I think what I started doing, completely accidentally, and I had no idea I was doing this, was modelling something. And I think that's what we've been doing in prisons, and I think that's why it's become so successful. In 2015, we did another piece of work where we actually were able to show the differences. So the blue lines, I think, on that one it looks like it's grey, but the darker coloured lines, they show the IESR score at the beginning, and the orange ones show it at the end. We can see significant changes in trauma symptoms. Having all of that knowledge and leaning into Alison's knowledge and other people's knowledge, we decided to go and find out whether we can make this whole wonderful system work, and now a model work in all 15 prisons across the Northwest during a global pandemic when the majority of us were in PPE, full PPE. The first 3 weeks of my work in prison during the pandemic, so the 23rd of March, the Prime Minister locked us all down. I was in full PPE, wandering around the prisons, hearing this, "Whoa, you look right, dickhead!" And I thought, yeah, I did actually. It doesn't suit me, PPE. But that's what we did. We did that because it felt really important to not stop our services. So Outspoken was born. Why is it called Outspoken? Well, because we want people to be outspoken. We're also hoping at some point they'll be out of prison. The idea is that in some way we begin to help people deal with their trauma in every single way that you do it in the community or in other areas, to begin to allow people to get a real sense of self, allow them to be the people that they really should have been, allow them to, and as many of us know, allow survivors to survive and thrive and just be brilliant individuals. Tiborn Anderson, who is an academic, Professor Emeritus I think he is now, he said that shame and guilt have become the hallmark of the victim. And it really resonates with me that, as a survivor, it resonates with me from, if guilt is the thing I did bad, and shame is the thing I am bad, I carried those so often in my life. And then when I first stepped into prison, I noticed so many people carrying the same, maybe I would argue heavier, shame and guilt. And so we decided to kind of tackle it and say, no. Okay, so you have done some terrible things. Let's put that down to one side for a second, because probation's dealing with that and psychology's dealing with that, and let's look at what happened to you. Not what have you done, not what you did, not how you got here, because for me, I think that just perpetuates that shame and guilt. I'm interested in, where are you? What happened to you? And so we began to talk about it. Our service has always been underpinned by Judith Herman's model of trauma and recovery in a really simple sense. Stabilisation, processing, integration. That journey is definitely not linear, but I've got no idea how to draw it not linear. So let's just pretend that that's not linear, because it jumps back and forth. But there's something really important about that process. And so I started dealing with people. I started holding space for people. I started leaning into going out on the wings, not just sat in my clinic room, because going out on the wings is really scary. And then I realised it wasn't scary. I just realised it was just a load of men, and then in the female state, a load of women who are all terrified. They're all absolutely petrified of being there, but nobody wants to admit it. And so I realised, well, if they're scared and I'm scared, well, it'll be all right. And I started meeting some of the most inspiring individuals who genuinely wanted to create change, but nobody was giving them a chance. And so Seb came along, and Seb had been sexually abused majority of his life. And then at age 18, a particular situation when he was dealing drugs resulted in the loss of someone's life. Seb didn't even know that he'd killed his victim until he was watching the news and saw the person's picture come up. The shame and guilt that he carried about that index offence was massive. It was like it was overshadowing everything else. And so we got talking. And we got talking not because some professional referred him in, because they didn't. I was walking across the yard one afternoon and I just get shouted at, "Oi, boss, come here. And I go, "What? Are you the abuse guy?" Genuinely, that's what we got called. And I went, "Yeah, I think so. What? My mate comes to speak to you and he said I should speak to you." I was like, "Oh, okay then. You free now?" "Yeah, okay." I said, "Come on then." And we just went and sat down. We just had 5 minutes. Just said to me, some shit happened when I was a kid. Never dealt with it. Think maybe it's time for me to deal with it. And I was like, okay. And that was that. And we just started chatting. Did my assessment. He did his score. His first score showed me how not traumatised he was. And then about 5 sessions in, we did it again. And he told me the truth. It's why I get frustrated with some of our NHS way of doing things. I love the NHS. But I get frustrated that we take the first and last. I think we should be doing the worst and best. I think that will give us a better indication. But Seb started talking, started opening up. He couldn't say abuse, he couldn't say rape, he couldn't say those words. He just used to say that thing. And that was fine. We just went with that thing. We just went with whatever language it was useful for him. And using my Judith Herman's model, stabilisation, processing, integration, I began to conceptualise how I'm going to work with Seb. The first few weeks, we just chatted about life. He asked me some questions. He asked me about my wedding ring. How's your wife? Well, actually, it's not a wife. It's a husband. Oh, right, how's your husband? Like, when people start talking about toxic masculinity, I get it. I think it's a wrong conversation. I think what we should really be talking about is toxic gender norms. That's the proper conversation. Because if we unpacked all of that, we'd really start understanding who we are and what are we still subscribing to. Because I was subscribing to this idea that Seb will be massively homophobic, etc., etc. Wasn't. Genuinely couldn't give a shit. Do you know what he cared about? Was he going to be there next week? Was he going to be able to get his session? Would I be able to go and unlock his door and get him out? Because what if it's a training thing and I'm on lockdown? Yeah, don't worry about it, I'll come and get you. What Seb then began to do was go round the wing and say to people, "You're mental, you need to go and speak to Dunk." And slowly but surely, the organisation and the service grew until we get to the point where in just 23, 24, we've seen over 1,700 prisoners. The majority of the prisoners are aged, the men are aged between 30 and 39. We also work within the female estate. We work with our sister organisation at Greater Manchester Rape Crisis for that. We've been asked to start thinking more and more about the, let's just call it the secure estate. How do we begin to talk about individuals and support individuals? When I looked at the data when I was putting some of these slides together, and I saw that 13,190 engagements, contacts and activities. Remember, in prison, it's all face to face. You can't ring someone. Well, I mean, you can, but you're not supposed to, because nobody has phones in prison. Some of the cells now have their own phone, but 99% of those contacts are face-to-face. That's my amazing outspoken team, Ali's staff, just going out on the wing and just chatting. It's phenomenal. It literally, it fills my heart with joy. 44% of prisoners that we worked with in 23-24 who had effectively an evidenced IAP score reliably recovered. That's phenomenal. That's more than your local IAP service. It's better than your local IAP service in the community. Who said prisoners won't come and talk? Looks like they're talking. And not only does it look like they're talking, it looks like it's actually having an impact. 74% showed a reliable improvement at the end of treatment. Vastly better than your local IAP service delivered by your GP, etc., etc. I'm really proud of that. And I know people get really pissy about it, but couldn't give a shit, honestly, because the team worked so hard to deliver that. 94% of individuals at assessment met the same, what's called caseness, the same level, an IAPT level in the community at like step 3, step 4. So we're talking about people with really significant need, with long and enduring mental health issues, trauma, etc., etc. We've had to develop our pathway. We've had to make sure that we're doing things safely and in the right way. We've had to help create culture change, because what you can't do is you can't just rock up to a prison and be like, "Hey, do you want to do some therapy?" Because there's a culture within prisons of things happening behind closed doors. Does that sound familiar to my fellow survivors in the room? And what we have to do is we have to be transparent. And we have to really talk to people. So much of the work, about the first 3 months before going in, every time we go to it, opened up a new prison, for about 3 months prior to us actually starting therapy, we just go in and talk to staff and really begin to change that culture and get word out there so people really understand what it is that we're doing. I understand that actually prisoners do want to be spoken to, they do want to heal, they do want to reclaim their lives, they do want to change. Contrary to popular belief, particularly over the last week or so with the early release scheme, where the press would want you to believe there is just this crazy thing happening. All we've done is we've just let a few people out 10% earlier than they would have done anyway. I think we just all need to calm down a little bit. However, I fully understand that for many survivors, it's been really frightening. I think that's a communications problem, quite frankly. I don't think we did very well on this communication. I'm fully aware TST staff are going to start waving at me to get off, but they'll have to wait. Yeah. You'll be all right. You'll be fine. We've done some teaching. We've taught people how to engage. We deliver a handbook to all of the staff in the prisons to really make sure that everybody understands how we're working with people. Are these slides going out?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this slide here was actually from a prison officer. So here's the thing, I'm sure some of you have experienced this as well. The moment that you start talking in a brand new space, staff go, can I have a word with you? And they begin to make disclosures. How many times have you been to deliver a training course or a conference and someone tugs you coat at this side? Oh, can I just speak to you? Because what we've done is we've created a space for people to talk. So you have to think about that too. So the last word I'm going to give to one of the other survivors.